will you have enough to retire? So our agenda really for today, so a couple things I wanted to really focus on. So number one is there an actual magic number that we can kind of strive for to hit to basically allow us to retire? Does a number like that exist, or is it simply more complicated than that? And and if it is more complicated than that, then what are the key elements that we should be considering when planning for retirement? So if you're meeting with your, let's say, financial advisors, or you're doing some of the number crunching yourself, what are the really important things that you have to at least think about for a moment, just to make sure that you don't miss anything important? And then the third thing I wanted to touch on is, what if you might not have enough? So what if maybe you're getting a little bit older, maybe you haven't been investing as much as you should have? What are some of the big levers that you can pull to basically get caught up? What are kind of the biggest things that are going to have the biggest impact? All right, so that's what we'll cover for today. All right, so just a little bit about who I am. I know we have some, I recognize some of the names here already, so I know some of you are listeners of the show just from our emails back and forth. But for everybody that doesn't really know who I am, I'll tell you kind of my story a little bit. So basically, a big thing was that we got mortgage free at 29. So what we did is, my wife, we had kind of her salary paid for, we were saving quite a bit, so we had basically her salary cover our sort of day-to-day expenses, and then we had around my salary to basically put towards the mortgage to pay it down as quickly as possible. So that was kind of a big thing. It got published in kind of the major magazines, and it was definitely a big milestone. So at 29 we were able to do it. We paid off our mortgage in 6 years, so that worked out really well. But once we did that, the kind of next thing was, okay, well, our house is paid off, but obviously, if you're paying off your house, you're not really investing, right? You're putting all the money towards the house, not towards your RSPs, not towards your TFSAs, and so kind of the next step on our journey was, okay, let's figure out, I need to learn kind of everything that there is to learn about investing. I want to learn about retirement planning. That's sort of the next natural progression. And so I basically, kind of consumed everything I could on the topic before actually getting started in investing myself. But one of the things that I really wanted to do was get a broad perspective from other financial experts across Canada. So, the kind of typical thing is, someone picks a financial planner and then they kind of count on them for all their advice, which is okay. But I thought, well, what would be neat would be to actually pick the brains of, different financial experts, different financial planners, different professional investors, from across Canada, and then basically where I can interview them and they can sort of share their practices, they can share some of their secrets, their tips. That way we can kind of all basically learn together, and that way we're not getting the opinions of just one person. We're able to kind of get learn from other experts all over, in different areas of personal finance from all across Canada, as opposed to only hearing a lot of these kind of US related facts, realize all these different things about the US, but what about Canada? We're obviously a lot different here. So that was really what I wanted to focus on. And I mean, the podcast has done pretty well. I'm really happy with it. I took these screenshots yesterday, so in terms of the rankings, it was number 3 in the investing category, and then if you look for personal finance, it basically comes up as number 2, and it's number 1 as far as Canadian personal finance goes. So so it's done really well, and then yeah, it's gonna keep going. It's all totally free, so you can definitely check it out at bewolfcan.ca. And yeah, we interview a lot of great people on the show. So that was kind of, when we're talking about the retirement planning and how to make sure you have enough to retire, a lot of it I'll be taking from what I've learned as well on the podcast, interviewing all these different guests. And then the next kind of progression was I started working with a company called Snap Projections, and they basically have a financial planning software that they have developed. So this is a financial planning software that financial planners use across Canada. And so, by working with them, by doing some work for them, what that allowed me to do was basically talk to different financial planners across Canada and help them when they're making plans for their clients. So when they have kind of regular clients coming to them, they want to make certain recommendations to them, but there's certain things they might not know, let's say, how to do in the software. So I would help them with things like that. And so, what that allowed me to do was basically, talk to a lot of different financial planners across Canada, different situations, work on different types of clients. And so, similar to the podcast, it helped me gain a pretty kind of broad understanding of, financial planning, retirement planning within Canada. And so, I bring this up because, these are some of the things that I wanted to share with you, both things that I've learned, doing the podcast interviewing the experts, as well as helping financial planners across Canada with the financial projections for their clients. So this is kind of a like a knowledge sharing, if you will. All right, so in introduction, to get started, basically, the number one question is there a magic number that we can just strive for and hit, and basically, not have to worry about retirement at all? And then the answer is that there really isn't a single magic number. The amounts can really, really vary quite a bit from person to person. It really depends a lot. One of the bigger things is it really depends on your spending. So, as far as a real life example goes, I mean, we hear sometimes stories about people who are kind of, they live to a country where the cost of living is a lot lower. So, let's say they're earning, high incomes in, let's say, Toronto, and then they move to somewhere, in South America, places like that, to retire, where the cost of living is a lot lower. So, that's kind of the one people who, those types of people are obviously going to need a lot less, than somebody, than kind of the average Canadian, right? And then there is the other extreme, people who simply, have these really, sort of fancy lifestyles, and they want to be able to maintain those in retirement. And so obviously, their number is going to be a lot bigger. And I remember actually working with a specific client, a financial planner, who basically had a client where, she was a widow, her husband died, but he left her basically millions of dollars. He was a successful businessman, he sold it. So she was basically set for life. I mean, millions in the bank, could live a very, very comfortable lifestyle, never worry about anything at all. However, or not worry about money ever at all. But we actually had to create a plan, or I had to help this planner make a plan to show her how she's actually running out of money, because this particular individual was just spending so much every single year that despite having millions in the bank, she was actually slowly going bankrupt. And so this is just kind of two extreme examples, but it just goes to show that no matter how much you make, how much you have saved, you can always spend more, and so there isn't really sort of one number that we can say, okay, this is one that everybody can hit. There we go. All right, so because of that kind of bad news, what can you do? So really, I think to make this presentation most beneficial to you, I thought it'd be good to basically inform you of all the kind of critical elements that you should be considering when you're doing planning. So basically, when you're trying to figure out how much you need, it's something that's very specific to you, specific to your assets, to your circumstances, to your situation, to your preferences, to the lifestyle that you want to live. And so kind of, I think the best that I can do for you at this point is just to give you sort of, what are the key things to consider. And number two is, you basically have to crunch the numbers. You actually have to go do the math, and you can either do it yourself. So, if you're good with Excel, if you're pretty decent at math, I'll tell you all the different things, and you can try to model it out in Excel, but, most of us aren't particularly in that route. We don't want to start building, financial models that way. And so what you can do is you can basically have someone do it for you that basically has access to the tools, has access to the knowledge. So, somebody like a financial planner, the money coach, it's something that I can do as well. So this is something kind of a route that I recommend that you take to basically have a second set of eyes, that has kind of the tools, the experience to take a look and crunch the numbers for you. And you can definitely still do it yourself as well, but it's always nice to get a second person, get a second opinion for somebody to kind of do that for you as well. And then that way you can make sure that you're not missing anything critical. Okay. So yeah, so like I said, the goal will really just to be kind of, think of this presentation a little bit like a checklist. So I want to just kind of show you all the different things so that if you're sitting down with a financial planner or a money coach, you're able to basically talk kind of intelligently with them, you're knowledgeable about all the different things, and you can come up with a good strategy to basically hit your goal. But of course, I'll still provide you with some rough ballpark numbers as well, just so that you kind of have a general idea as to how much you need. Okay, so let's start off with the ballpark figures. All right, so if you go out there and you kind of do your own research and you look around as to kind of what sort of different experts, in Canada, what are they saying after they've crunched the numbers, you'll find that the amount right now in today's dollars is around $600,000 to $650,000 for a couple before tax. Okay, so that's kind of the most common number that you'll see come up over and over and over again. Now, there's different ways to kind of get these ballpark figures. So that's one, but kind of one way that you can calculate it yourself relatively quickly, just to give you sort of a ballpark figure, is the 4% rule, which you might have heard of. And basically what that says is that, let's say that we take the $600,000, from our kind of from our previous example here. So if we take 600,000 and we take 4% of that, then that's basically saying, okay, we're going to be able to withdraw $24,000 from our portfolio every single year. Now, one kind of big thing to remember is you definitely want to include the CPP and OAS, so basically the government benefits that we get in retirement. So right now, I mean, this number can also vary from person to person, but generally speaking, if you're a couple, you can basically assume roughly that you're going to get around $30,000 in benefits together as a couple. So if you get if you add this $30,000 plus this $24,000 in total, you're going to get about $54,000 a year pre-tax. So you have a $600,000 portfolio, you're getting $30,000 from the government, you're getting another $24,000 from your savings. And so this is kind of if you go out there and once again you do your research, you'll find out that $54,000 is a relatively reasonable amount to have in retirement for today's dollars. You can pretty much live a pretty sort of middle class lifestyle with that kind of money. And it might be a lot lower than what you may be expecting, but the expenses do tend to go down quite a bit in retirement, and we'll cover that a little bit later. Okay, so that's just, that's one way of doing it, is the 4% rule. Another common way, if you want to kind of, run your own rough numbers really quick, is to do 25 times your annual retirement spend, not including CPP and OAS. So, let's say we wanted that $55,000 that we just spoke about. So another way that you could do it is you could say, okay, we want this $55,000. So once again, we're going to get this $30,000 CPP and OAS. And, in order to get to 55, we have to get another $25,000 from our savings. So then what you do is you just say, okay, 25,000, and we're going to multiply it by 25. So if you do that, you're going to get a total of 625,000. So so that's just another way that you can kind of do the math yourself very, very quickly. It's one of those things, that if you absolutely have no idea how much you need, this is kind of something maybe to help you get started. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if you are single, then you definitely don't want to be dividing, these numbers by 2. So you might have heard kind of the adage that, if two people can live as cheaply as one, right? And that's not necessarily true 100%, but if you are living with someone, if you have a husband or wife, partner, if you are doing that, you are able to. There are certain efficiencies that you get. There are certain sort of cost savings by by being together, and so. If you are single, then yeah, you could decrease. I find you can decrease your sort of total portfolio. If we're ballparking between $25,000 and $100,000, you can decrease it by that amount. But it's not like you were going to take 625 and divide it by 2 because you're living single. That's basically just not the reality. So something to be careful of. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and this is a really kind of easy trap to fall into, is that, if let's say you do these sort of ballpark figures and you see, okay, sure, I'm going to aim for 625,000 for now. That sounds good. I'm going to do that. Well, realistically, if you're not retiring, let's say for, let's say 30 more years, then you actually need a lot more than that, than the 625, because this is, how much you need kind of as of today in today's dollars. But because of inflation, you're actually going to need a significantly more amount of money. And I'll show you a second exactly kind of how inflation impacts it, but it's quite significant. I mean, if you're retiring in, let's say, 25 years, you might need actually, double this to kind of have the same amount of purchasing power. So, it's a very easy trap to fall into, to, be in your, let's say, you're 30, and you say, okay, I need to earn 625,000, have that in my portfolio in 30 years. That's not true. Okay, you have to factor in that inflation piece. So I'll go over that a little bit later, but just be very, very careful of that, because kind of one of the worst things you can do is sort of assume that you're saving enough when you really aren't, and then when you get close to retirement, you're scrambling because you basically did the math wrong. So that's just something that's really important to keep in mind. All right, so those are sort of some, like I said, those are really kind of rough estimates just to give you a nice kind of ballpark figure, and those kind of 3 sources of how you can get that kind of final retirement number. But the problem with that is that there are really a lot of assumptions in those numbers, and not all of them apply to you. So if you actually go and you research sort of any of these methods, or you get a you go online and you find a good article where they talk about this number, oftentimes what you'll see is an entire paragraph underneath just filled with assumptions that they had to use to come up with that number. And and a lot of those assumptions may not necessarily apply to you. So it's a little bit dangerous to assume that that number for sure will apply to you, and that's all the work that you have to do to make sure that you're set for retirement. So this is just kind of a little warning that you should be aware of as well. And what happens is things get a lot more complicated when you want more accuracy. So for example, what if you want to retire early? Well, if you retire early, then you're not going to get those, if you want to retire at 50, you're not going to get those retirement benefits at 50. So you have to have extra money to offset that, right? So that's something that's not necessarily factored in. Inflation, we already talked about. You have to, of course, factor that in, because obviously you're going to need a lot more, as time goes on. Your housing situation can make a very big impact. If there's a housing crash, that makes a difference. If you have a house, if you're mortgage free, that's one situation. If you're renting, that's another. So, housing obviously is, tends to be one of the top expenses that we have. That can obviously make a very, very big impact in terms of how early you can retire. Your work pension obviously can make a very, very big difference. If you have a really solid pension at work, maybe you work for the government, that's going to give you a really, that's going to shift how much you need to save yourself privately. And of course, your risk tolerance. So if you're very, very conservative, if you don't like risk, you don't want your portfolio to fluctuate much, let's say while you're in retirement, then you're going to need a lot more to be able to sustain yourself over the long term. So you can see here, there's a lot of these sort of variables that you have to consider, and those are going to be different from person to person. And so that's why it's kind of dangerous just to go with one number and assume that that's always the correct answer. Okay, so like I said, the goal is just to give you, it will be kind of to give you somewhat of a checklist so that you have kind of all those critical elements available to you. All right, so let's begin. Let's start with the easy ones. So the first thing obviously you want to do is make sure tax is factored in and make sure it's specific to Canada and your province. Okay, so like I kind of already alluded to before, there's a lot of US advice out there online. So if you're crunching the numbers yourself, make sure you're actually using Canadian numbers, because our rules or tax laws are a lot different. Also, obviously make sure that you're taking into account, that your advisor is taking into account what province you're in. So right now, there's a lot of advisors out there that you may be working with that are actually outside of your province, right? And so, you might be talking just over the phone, over Skype. It's totally possible to do that. Make sure that that advisor knows which province you're actually from, because there are, obviously provincial taxes vary from province to province, and that is something you want factored into your projections. Okay, so that's kind of the sort of somewhat obvious, but definitely worth mentioning just in case. Okay. Also, you really want to dig up all the critical information about your spouse. So, for example, all the pension information, any other assets and accounts that they have. Now, this is kind of easier said than done. There's a good chance that if you're on this webinar, that that you're kind of the investment, the personal finance person in your household, and maybe your spouse isn't. So you may have to chase them a bit, to get that information about the, about their pension, for example. But it's obviously a very, very critical component. If your spouse has a really good pension, that can definitely shorten the amount of how much you have to save every month in order to have enough for retirement. So you definitely want to make sure that you have a holistic view of all of your finances. You don't want to just kind of estimate or just include what you have. Okay. All right. So let's talk about kind of what to expect. So the first thing is retirement age. And so oftentimes, when I've spoken to different planners, a lot of them are working on clients that are going to be retiring fairly soon. And so a really common age that's used is to do sort of your retirement projections until age 90. So basically assuming that you're going to, pass away kind of at 90 years old or earlier. So that seems to be the most common number that I've seen. However, if you're younger, like let's say you're in your 30s, maybe even 40s, it's not uncommon to use a higher number like 100. Obviously, there's a lot of advances in medical technology that's happening right now, and you definitely want to be more on the conservative side as well, because obviously you'd rather have more money than not enough. And so kind of 100 is sort of the default that I use when I kind of run my own numbers, but 90 is something that if you are retiring fairly soon, that's a number that I would like I said, that I've seen used quite a bit as well. Okay. Now, inflation, like I already mentioned, that's going to have a really, really enormous impact. And so what happens is, right now, the Bank of Canada, their target is basically 2%. So they're kind of, they've kind of said outright that they're trying to keep inflation at 2%. And they're pretty good at doing it. However, historically, inflation tends to be around the 3% mark. And so if you're kind of doing your own numbers, generally you want to make sure that inflation is somewhere between, either 2%, 3%, maybe 2.5%, kind of if you want to take the middle road. That's kind of the most common number to use. And just to show you really quick what kind of an impact this has, because I think this illustrates it really well. So, all right, so in terms of spending, so, let's say that, okay, here we just have year 1, year 2, just going all the way down, and then here we have the actual year, so starting in 2016. So if we're spending, let's say, in retirement, we're saying, okay, we're going to spend, let's say, $50,000 a year, kind of, this is how much purchasing power we're going to have. Well, if we start applying inflation to it of 3%, you can see that, for example, in year 2, we would actually need $51,500 in order to buy the same amount that $50,000 worth of that $50,000 bought just a year ago. All right, so you can see as the years progress, like in this case now it costs over $53,000 to buy that same amount of goods that would normally cost us $50,000 today. So this makes a really, really big impact, and I think to help illustrate how big of a deal this is, if you go all the way down and we see, okay, 25 years from now, so in the year 2040, so if you wanted to buy, if you wanted to buy something that's worth $50,000 kind of in today's dollars, you would actually need over $101,000. Okay, so basically you would need double you basically need double to buy the same amount of goods. And kind of the most kind of common example that I've heard used was with newspapers or Coca-Cola, right? When you see some of those, maybe those old ads where a can of Coke or a newspaper cost a few cents instead of $1, for example, right? So that's basically inflation at work. We kind of see it happen in real life, and this is kind of how you can see it, in the numbers right here. And so this is once again going back to that previous point where if we say today, okay, you need, let's say, $600,000. Well, if you're not going to retire for another 25 years, you're obviously going to need a lot more than $600,000 because that $600,000 might only be able to buy $300,000 worth of goods, at that stage, right? And so this is a reason why, if you're working with a planner, if you're crunching the numbers yourself, this is something that you really, really want to make sure that you consider. Okay, and so the lesson that kind of one of the key lessons that I have when it comes to this is, don't fall into the trap that some arbitrary number is high enough. So something like, okay, well, $1 million sounds like a lot of money. I'm going to aim for that. That sounds good enough for me. You can kind of see that, with inflation, that might not necessarily be true depending on what your, when you factor in kind of what your expense is and how just prices of goods tend to go up over time. $1 million might definitely not be enough for you. So, kind of, don't fall into the trap of just kind of, taking the easy way out and just kind of assuming that a number that seems high will actually be sufficient. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do when we're doing this kind of retirement planning is we want to be able to forecast our expenses. What are our expenses going to be in retirement? And I'll give you some ballpark figures as well based on different studies that have been done, but I'll show you as well how you can get a somewhat more accurate number by figuring this out yourself approximately. So what you do, so the very first step is find out what you're spending right now. And one of the easiest ways that I found to do that is just to use something like mint.com. And I know I heard Quicken does something similar, but I personally use Mint. And so, what they will do is basically you can hook up your accounts to it and they will automatically download your transactions and they will automatically categorize them for you. And so all you have to do is go in and just make sure that, it categorized it properly. And so this is kind of a really quick way of knowing, how much you're spending on what types of expenses. And this is, I prefer this quite a bit. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but I tend to recommend them a fair bit personally, just because I mean, the thought of having to manually enter my receipts and try to count, how much I spent on groceries this week would just be very, very painful. Nobody likes to do kind of data entry of receipts in their spare time. So thankfully, there's technology out there now. Mint.com, Quicken as well, I believe, does it, where you're able to kind of get that information. So, once you have that, once you know what you're spending and what you're spending your money on, the second step is to eliminate the expenses that you won't incur while you're not working. But so here are some of the things that when you are in retirement, expenses that you are likely not to have. So for example, an extra car. Cars are pretty much, cars and housing are pretty much the top two expenses for most people. And so if you have two cars right now with your spouse, then if you generally if you don't have to go to work anymore, your spouse doesn't have to go to work, one car is probably going to be enough. And so if you have a car loan, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You're saving money on insurance, you're saving money on maintenance, you're saving money on gas. We're going down from from two cars to one, obviously can make a really, really big impact on how much you need month to month in your retirement. Clothing as well, if you're not working, you're not getting close for work anymore, that can be a saver. Going out to eat, generally with coworkers, obviously it's more expensive to go eat with coworkers for lunch. You're saving money there. Hopefully by that time you're mortgage free, so there's no more mortgage payments. So that's another really, really big one that you have a really large expense that you've basically eliminated. Child care and other child expenses. So we have a daughter now. childcare can get expensive. There's other things obviously you're always buying for the kids. Those are things that you're not going to have. So if you've downloaded all your transactions and you've categorized them, and if you want to find out roughly what you'll need in retirement to live the kind of lifestyle maybe that you're living now, you can kind of find these items and you can subtract them from your spending to get a kind of a more accurate picture of what your expenses will look like in retirement. But unfortunately, we're not done. We have to add some new expenses as well. So, when you're in retirement, you may want to do some extra travel. Maybe, you want to take that Europe trip you've always wanted. Maybe you'd like to buy a cottage or rent a cottage, or maybe some people buy trailers, right? And they go and they tour around Canada or the US. Maybe you'll have to take care of your parents. Maybe you're going to have to, put them in the home, or maybe they didn't prepare enough for the retirement. They're going to need some help with their living expenses. So these are kind of three, I would say, of the more common expenses that I've seen that should be factored in potentially, when you're looking at what your expenses will be in retirement. And of course, there's other considerations as well. So for example, are you going to pay for your kids' weddings? If so, factor that in. University and college for your kids, if you're going to do that, if you're going to pay for that, make sure you factor that into your spending when you're doing your retirement projections. As well as, if you want to contribute to charity, if you want to leave an estate for your children, obviously make sure to factor that in as well. So these are kind of things to, just like I said, kind of a checklist so that you can quickly go through these when you're kind of doing a plan, or if you're talking with a financial planner or money coach, anything like that, and you can make sure that they're factoring these things in, or that at least you're factoring them in. Okay. Oh, and this is my little final point, which might be cut off once again because for some reason the bottom of the screen is cut off. But basically, it is common for expenses to decrease with age, and so I've seen planners handle this differently. So what some planners do is they'll say, okay, let's say you retire at 60. So they'll say, okay, for the first 10 years, they're going to be very active years. We're going to be spending more money actually, or maybe the same amount, because we're going to be doing a lot of traveling. We're going to live a very kind of active lifestyle. And then after 10 years, our health might not be as good, so we're going to slow things down a little bit. We're not going to spend as much. And so, definitely what you can do is you can kind of have it in different sort of retirement life stages, where you have sort of your active years and then you have your less active years. Some people will kind of even do it in 3 years. So your very active years, your somewhat active years, and your non-active years at all, where you're basically, you're sitting at home, your health might not be very good, you've kind of, you've already seen the world, and so your spending is sort of, at a minimum at that point. So, there's different ways that I've seen, planners handle this. I've even seen some where what they'll do is they'll actually decrease the spending by 2 to 3% per year to factor in the fact that you are spending less in retirement. So, lots of different ways to handle it, but definitely, don't assume that, okay, if you retire at 60 and at 61 you spend a lot of money because you take that Europe trip you always wanted. Obviously, that's not going to be every single year. Those expenses are going to be declining as you age, unless you have some, unforeseen kind of medical issues that are going to cost you more. But, apart from that, generally, your expenses will be going down. So, make sure to factor that in. Okay, so that's kind of how you can do it yourself, and I find that's a really good approach, just from talking to different planners and kind of doing my own research on it. But there actually have been some sort of studies that others have done, and so what you see right here on the left is a study done by BMO. They basically just surveyed a bunch of retirees to find out what it is that they're each spending, and so these are rates that you can see per person. So for example, national 28,800. You can kind of see how it is. Sort of, depending on the different parts of Canada. So if you're a couple, you basically multiply this number by 2. And then if you go and you do some research and you look at other sources, what you'll find is that generally, and this is kind of consistent with what the BMO study says, is you'll see that generally people find that retirees spend between $35,000 and $62,000 per couple after tax, assuming they have no debt and no mortgage, and this is of course all in today's dollars. So so if you're looking kind of for a quick ballpark figure, before you kind of crunch your own numbers, this is kind of a common one to do. Obviously, that is a big of a gap. 35% is kind of you're sort of living on the minimal, you're being pretty frugal, versus 62,000 is okay, you're living relatively comfortably. It's not some luxurious lifestyle, but you are able to travel a bit. You're able to kind of do some of these more extracurricular things. You're not just kind of meeting the bare minimum. So, that's why there's a bit of a range there. It really depends on the kind of lifestyle that you'd like to lead. Okay. All right, so the next component is, obviously a really critical component when you're looking at your retirement is what kind of rates of return can I expect on my different investments. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. I did an entire episode on this not too long ago, and this actually chart is basically from that episode where I looked at several different sources, really good sources, and they looked at, okay, what can I generally expect on Canadian bonds versus U.S. equities versus Canadian equities versus the international developed equities, emerging markets. So this kind of gives you a bit of a gauge as to what you can expect. And I have here both conservative and optimistic, and then I have nominal returns and real returns. So nominal being it does not take into account inflation, and real means that it does take into account inflation. So you'll see real returns are lower because we're factoring in inflation. And so this can be useful because if you're, let's say, once again, you're meeting with a financial planner, a money coach, it's good for you to know what you can realistically expect, if they're doing the investment. So if they're using some really high, numbers, you can kind of call them on that basically, right? Or if their numbers seem kind of a little, very low, you can say, well, why is that? Maybe you're paying very high fees and that's why the numbers are so low. So, these are kind of something that you can once again have kind of in your back pocket just to make sure that, when someone gives you numbers, offers you something, says you can get some sort of return, these are kind of the typical returns you can expect, if you're investing in the broad market. So if you're doing, for example, index investing. Okay, and you can download this chart and you can actually listen to the whole episode for free. You can go to buildwealthcanada.ca/29, and you can kind of listen to kind of all the details about that. You can pull this chart and you can view all the resources that I got these from as well. Okay, and yeah, this is just kind of to give you a little bit more information in terms of what kind of rates of return you can expect. So, the software that I use right now to do retirement projections, they by default they actually keep things very conservative. So these numbers are actually lower than kind of what we just saw in this chart here. But once again, the whole kind of reasoning behind it is that we would like to be conservative when we're doing retirement projections. It's better to have too much money than not enough, and so that's why when for cash we put 1%, fixed income 2.5%, and equity 6%. So that's kind of, I would say, if you're looking for a really conservative type of scenario, these are pretty good numbers to use. And then you can always run different scenarios. What if the markets do a bit better or closer to the average versus what if the market don't perform as well, and so you kind of use these more conservative numbers. Okay, and so once again, this is the link, and then these are the three sources that I used for that information. So these three resources are available. If you go to this link, you can click on these links and you can basically go there. I didn't put the links in here because they're very actually you can see it here, they're very long, so there's no way you'd be able to type all of them in. But if you go here, I have the links right by the chart, and you can click on them and check them out. So PWL does a really great study, where they look at sort of what you can expect with your returns. So I use them for kind of one of the key sources. There's a really good book called Global Asset Allocation, and basically what they did there is they looked at what are the returns you can expect depending on different portfolios. And yeah, it's just it's a good book. It kind of gives you a really good idea as to just to make sure that your expectations are in check, that you're not expecting 13% growth every year forever. So this is kind of a really good a book that I enjoyed reading as well. And just as an aside, what you'll find when you read this book is that because there's all these different portfolios that you can make when you have your kind of when you're planning for retirement. But what they actually found is that if you take kind of the most popular portfolios that are recommended out there, they all actually perform very similarly. There isn't really giant differences in the rates of return that they earn. But what's interesting is that the biggest impact of what your returns are actually the fees that you pay. So if you're in for example very high fee mutual funds, like if you're paying 2.5% for mutual funds, for example, those things will have a bigger will tend to have a bigger negative impact on your return than which kind of which type of portfolio that you choose. So I won't go into more detail on that, but just to kind of keep things focused about kind of retirement planning. But this is just something that's very interesting to see. And then there's another report, the Credit Suisse report, where they talk about Canada and what they expect for Canada and things like that. So it's pretty interesting reading, if you want to dive deep and kind of look at the different sources. All right, so moving on, other key factors to consider. Obviously, you want to take into account your employment income. Factor in the fact that you are most likely going to get promotions as you go through as you go through your work. So if you're earning, let's say, 50,000 right now, or whatever that number is, chances are you're not going to be earning that until until you retire, right? So make sure that that is factored in. If you're meeting with your advisor, money coach, etc. At least factor in inflation as well. So even if you're not expecting to get promoted, whatever the case may be, maybe that's not a focus for you, then at least you can probably much assume that your salary is still going to go up at least by a bit to adjust for inflation. You might not get an inflation adjustment every year, but you're not going to be earning the same salary realistically for the next 30 years. So make sure that that's factored in as well. And are you going to take some time off to stay with the kids? So if you're going to have a child, maybe you're going to take a year off. Maybe your wife or your husband's going to take a year off to take care of the kids. So if that's something, that's a conversation worth having with them. Maybe they want to homeschool the kids. Things of that nature. These are important conversations to have, because obviously they're going to have a very big impact. You're not going to pay as much for childcare expenses, but now you have one less income coming in, right? So these are important things to consider, and it's something worth having a conversation about with your partner.